The night the police arrived at Grandpa's house, their cruiser lights washing the old porch in red and blue like a crime scene, everyone on the block assumed the HOA had finally won. Because when an association files an emergency welfare and compliance request against a 90-year-old man who lives alone, people expect frailty, confusion, maybe a scared senior shuffling to the door. But what none of them expected, what the HOA president most certainly did not expect as she stood across the street with her arms folded and a smug smile stretched across her face, was the absolute stillness that followed the knock, the long silence that made even the officers glance at each other, and then the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps approaching from inside, not hurried or panicked or weak, but measured, heavy, controlled, like someone who had all the time in the world and no fear of whoever waited outside, because when the door finally opened it wasn't a trembling old man peering out in confusion, it was Grandpa standing straight-backed under the porch light, eyes sharp, posture disciplined, wearing the same pressed flannel shirt he'd worn every day since Grandma passed, his hand resting calmly on the doorframe as if he'd been expecting them. And in that single moment the officer's tone changed, their shoulders tightened, and something unspoken passed between them, something that said this wasn't going to be the routine HOA harassment call they'd been briefed on, not the elder neglect complaint, not the unapproved modifications issue, not the possible safety concern Karen had breathlessly described when she called it in, because Grandpa didn't ask why they were there, didn't apologize, didn't look surprised at all, he simply looked at them and said in a voice steady enough to cut through the flashing lights in the night air, "Evening, officers. You're about 10 minutes late," and the confidence in that sentence alone hit harder than any argument ever could, because confidence like that doesn't come from entitlement or arrogance, it comes from experience, from a life lived answering to far worse than an HOA board with a clipboard, and as the neighbors cracked their curtains wider and phones quietly came out to record, the HOA president's smile faltered just slightly, her certainty wavering for the first time since she'd decided. Grandpa's house, his non-compliant lawn, his unsafe fence, his refusal to attend meetings, was going to be her next public example because this was supposed to be simple, supposed to end with warnings, citations, maybe a forced compliance order, something she could brag about in the next newsletter, not this unsettling scene where the supposed victim stood unbothered and the police suddenly seemed unsure who was actually in charge, and as the taller officer cleared his throat and began reciting the complaint, Grandpa listened without interruption, nodding slowly, his eyes never leaving the HOA president across the street, not angry, not confused, just watchful, as if cataloging every move she made, every breath she took. And when the officer finally finished explaining that the HOA had requested a welfare check and inspection due to reports of unsafe conditions and possible cognitive decline, Grandpa smiled, not kindly, not cruelly but knowingly, and that smile alone sent a ripple of unease through the small audience gathering in the dark, because smiles like that usually mean someone has already lost and just doesn't realize it yet. And when Grandpa finally spoke again, quietly this time, he didn't argue the accusation or deny it or raise his voice at all, he simply said, "Before we go any further, you might want to check the file attached to this address." And when the officer hesitated and glanced down at his tablet, scrolling once, then twice, then stopping abruptly as his expression changed from professional neutrality to alert focus, the entire balance of power on that front porch shifted, because whatever was on that screen made him step back half a pace, made him straighten, made him look at Grandpa not as a confused elderly homeowner but as someone who required a different kind of respect. And as the younger officer leaned in to look as well, whispering something under his breath, the HOA president's confidence finally cracked, her arms tightening around herself as she realized, too late, that calling the police on Grandpa hadn't brought backup to her side at all, it had brought witnesses, and whatever door she thought she was forcing open tonight, Grandpa had just opened it himself on his terms, with the calm certainty of a man who had been underestimated his entire life and learned long ago exactly how dangerous that could make him. The tension didn't dissipate when the officers glanced at the files Grandpa had indicated. Instead, it thickened, pressing down on the porch like the humid summer air that seemed to stick to everyone's skin, and for the first time, the HOA president could feel it, that creeping dread that maybe she had miscalculated, because Grandpa didn't flinch as they scrutinized the documents, didn't fumble or stammer or apologize. He just stood there, quiet, letting the evidence speak for itself, and the evidence was damning in ways no HOA board meeting or petty citation could ever prepare her for. Contracts, legal documents, past court rulings, even photographs with timestamps that proved every claim she had made against him was laughably false. Her so-called violations, meticulously countered with proof of compliance, permits, and legal ownership that extended back decades, all while he folded his hands calmly in front of him, a hint of amusement in his gaze as he watched the color drain from her face, the smugness she had carried across the street now twisting into a frantic calculation of escape routes and excuses, because neighbors, previously quietly watching, had begun to murmur, and a few had even stepped onto their lawns to get a better view, cameras out, capturing the moment when the supposed powerless elder, the one they all thought of as frail and easily bullied, revealed himself as a man who not only knew exactly how to handle the law, but had mastered it to the point where a single glance could make trained officers hesitate, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same woman who had spent weeks drafting threats, sending letters, and making calls to assert her control over someone else's property, now frozen like a rabbit in headlights as Grandpa slowly opened the creaking gate that led to his backyard, revealing not just a tidy garden, not just a well-maintained house, but a fortified network of cameras, sensors, and other security measures that looked for all the world like a small tactical operation rather than a private residence. And the police officers, initially poised to lead the welfare check, now found themselves silently exchanging questions through narrow glances, each realizing that this was no ordinary elderly man, no ordinary call. And as Grandpa finally turned his gaze back toward the HOA president, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly, the neighbors could hear him speak with a calm authority that cut through the murmurs and the streetlights alike. "I suggest you step back now. You've overstepped in ways you can't begin to understand." And at that moment, the president of the HOA, who had been imagining headlines about her triumph, felt her stomach drop, felt the thin veneer of control she had cultivated in her carefully manicured life crumble in real time, because Grandpa wasn't just defending his home, he was demonstrating, in the subtlest and most terrifying way possible, that years of underestimating him had built a trap that she had just walked into willingly. That the officers, who had assumed this would be a routine call, were now painfully aware that their presence might only serve to complicate matters. And as the night deepened, shadows lengthening across the perfectly trimmed lawn, Grandpa's voice cut again, slow, deliberate, commanding, "I hope the people responsible for this visit have insurance, and a very good lawyer." And with that, the faintest smirk tugged at the corners of his mouth, because the calm, seemingly frail man everyone had doubted was anything but weak. He was a storm held in human form, and everyone within earshot, including the blinking police lights and the towering HOA president, could feel it brewing. The air felt electric as the officers exchanged uneasy glances, the file still open on the taller officer's tablet, reflecting the cold blue glow onto Grandpa's lined, unshakable face, and the HOA president's earlier bravado had now completely evaporated, replaced by a pale, taut anxiety that made her fingers twitch nervously against the clipboard she had brought as if it could somehow protect her, while Grandpa stepped aside with a subtle motion, allowing the officers to move further onto the porch, but not before locking eyes with the HOA president in a way that communicated not anger, not malice, but a depth of understanding that came from a lifetime of handling people like her, people who thought rules and bureaucracy could intimidate, could manipulate, could dominate. And as the officers cautiously approached, Grandpa gestured toward the living room, where, in the dim light of the lamps he had deliberately left on, the interior looked like a cross between a study and a command center, stacks of neatly organized files, photographs of property lines, receipts, and historical documents laid out with surgical precision, and the neighbors across the street who had crept closer were now gasping softly, whispering among themselves as their phones recorded every moment, because it was one thing to hear rumors that Grandpa was meticulous, that he had fought off threats to his land before, but it was entirely another to see it firsthand, to feel the aura of control and preparation radiating from someone they had all dismissed as fragile. And the taller officer finally cleared his throat, voice low and careful. "Sir, everything seems to be in order here." Perhaps the HOA complaint was premature, and Grandpa didn't flinch, didn't offer a sarcastic remark, he simply nodded, as though confirming an obvious truth that had been overlooked by those who had rushed in with authority but no understanding, and as the officer said the words, the HOA president's panic intensified, her mind racing through every possible excuse, every lie she could spin, but none of them felt sufficient. Not when the proof of her overreach was laid out like a challenge for the world to see. And then Grandpa, still calm, still measured, turned slightly, almost as if performing a gesture rather than speaking, and said with quiet menace, "I trust you understand the consequences of false claims now. I suggest we avoid repeating them." And the officer stiffened, realizing that this was more than a property dispute, more than a neighborhood feud. It was a calculated, preemptive assertion of authority by a man who had clearly spent decades preparing for moments just like this, and the HOA president, suddenly aware that she was being observed by everyone on the block, including a man who had just proven he was several moves ahead of her at all times, swallowed hard, feeling her confidence crumble as she realized that calling the police had not only failed to intimidate him, it had exposed her misjudgment, her audacity, and her vulnerability to anyone paying attention. And as she opened her mouth to protest, to plead, to demand, Grandpa's hand lifted slightly, palm outward, a subtle but unmistakable signal to pause, and the officers, trained to read such cues, froze, and in that suspended moment, the entire dynamic shifted. The HOA president was no longer the person in control of the narrative. She was merely a spectator watching someone who had always been underestimated demonstrate, with chilling calm, exactly why underestimating him had been a mistake, because Grandpa didn't just command the house, the property, or the evidence. He commanded the attention, the respect, and the fear of anyone foolish enough to think rules alone could bend him, and in that instant, the neighbors knew they were witnessing the quiet dismantling of an entire hierarchy of arrogance. 1. Careful, deliberate, measured action at a time as Grandpa stepped back into the house, closing the door behind him slowly, deliberately, leaving the officers blinking in the porch light and the HOA president frozen in disbelief, a living reminder that power isn't always visible, that experience is often underestimated, and that patience, preparation, and calm precision are far more dangerous than panic, shouting, or hastily drafted complaints ever could be. The tension on the street didn't dissipate after the door closed. In fact, it intensified in a way that made every person watching feel the weight of what had just happened, because the simple act of closing the door was more than a gesture. It was a statement, a declaration that Grandpa was not only in control of his home, his property, and his life, but that he had orchestrated the entire evening with the precision of a chess master who had already seen the moves of every piece on the board, and knew exactly when to strike. And as the HOA president staggered backwards slightly, gripping her clipboard as if it could shield her from the storm of embarrassment and impending consequence, Grandpa's calm voice carried from inside the house through the open windows, addressing the officers, neighbors, and inadvertently the entire block. You may think this is a simple matter, a routine check or a trivial complaint, but every action you take has consequences, and I assure you, every document, every interaction, and every misstep has already been accounted for. And in that moment, even the seasoned police officers, trained to anticipate danger and understand control, felt the subtle but unmistakable shift in the dynamic. This was no ordinary call, no simple elder welfare check, and certainly no HOA victory, because Grandpa's home was fortified not just with cameras and sensors, but with decades of experience, meticulous legal knowledge, and a history of observing people. Like the HOA president, people who relied on arrogance, bureaucracy, and self-importance to dictate their interactions with others, and as the words echoed down the street, neighbors whispered to each other, capturing every phrase on their phones, because what they were seeing was the unraveling of the HOA's assumed power in real time, the public humiliation of someone who had overreached without understanding the man he had tried to intimidate, and while the HOA president's face paled to the shade of freshly poured concrete, Grandpa's demeanor remained untouched, poised, and deliberate, a living testament to the kind of control that comes from preparation and patience rather than bluster or threats. And then, as if to punctuate the point, he stepped into view from a second-floor window, arms crossed, eyes locked on the street below, speaking again with calm authority. Those who underestimate me will find the costs are always higher than anticipated. And the words themselves, though spoken without anger, carried a weight that made the clipboard in the HOA president's hands feel suddenly absurd, a relic of powerless authority now rendered meaningless, while the officers, unsure how to proceed without escalating unnecessarily, kept glancing at each other, recognizing that any action on their part could be interpreted as siding with one party over another, and that the situation had already escalated far beyond their initial understanding. And as Grandpa's calm, unwavering voice continued to issue instructions and observations from inside the house, neighbors on the street began to murmur, some shaking their heads in awe, some whispering warnings, and a few even began live-streaming the unfolding confrontation, because what they were witnessing was more than an HOA feud. It was a study in power dynamics, in the consequences of arrogance, in the stark difference between those who act recklessly and those who act with decades of preparation. And the HOA president, now completely aware that every gesture, every word, every inch of her posturing was being recorded and evaluated, felt the full weight of her misjudgment, realizing too late that she had walked directly into the lion's den, and the lion, calm, measured, and infinitely patient, was already aware of her every move, anticipating every next step. And as the night deepened, the street lights casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns, Grandpa's silhouette framed in the second-floor window remained a symbol of quiet dominance, a reminder that underestimating someone based on appearances alone is a mistake often too costly to recover from. and that power is rarely about who shouts the loudest, who writes the stiffest letters, or who calls the most bureaucratic shots. It is about patience, knowledge, and the ability to act decisively at the precise moment when those around you are still fumbling in arrogance. And as the HOA president stumbled backward, finally, muttering something inaudible, the officers exchanged another glance, realizing with an uncomfortable chill that this evening would be recounted for years, that the story of an HOA misstep had just become a cautionary tale of what happens when someone dares to confront a man who has already anticipated their every move, and the block itself seemed to hold its breath, watching the unraveling drama play out like a slow-motion spectacle, because in that moment, control had shifted irrevocably, and Grandpa, calm as ever, had reminded everyone present that he was not a man to be trifled with, underestimated, or cornered, and that the consequences of such foolishness would be remembered far longer than the petty ambitions of those who had tried. The dawn was breaking over the quiet suburban street, but silence had never felt so heavy, so saturated with tension, as it did that morning when the HOA president realized that her calculated plan to humiliate Grandpa had utterly backfired, because in the stillness of the early light, every neighbor who had crept to the edges of their yards to witness the previous night's events could now see clearly that this was not a man who could be intimidated by petty rules, committee letters, or even the presence of uniformed officers. And as the HOA president clutched at her clipboard, her eyes darting nervously between the approaching figures on the porch and the towering oak shadows stretching across the driveway, the first hint of panic began to twist through her chest, because she understood, in a visceral and undeniable way, that everything she thought she controlled had been systematically dismantled in the span of hours, that every letter she had written, every citation she had issued, every smug post she had made in the neighborhood group chat now seemed absurdly naive, like the actions of someone playing checkers against a chess master who had already envisioned and neutralized every move, and the officers, standing uneasily on the porch, shifting their weight from one polished shoe to the other, whispered between themselves in low tones, their professional composure shaken by the realization that the man they had been sent to check on was operating on a completely different level, someone whose very presence exuded authority, strategy, and patience honed over decades. And Grandpa himself, seated comfortably in his recliner just inside the living room, glanced casually at the police, the HOA president, and the neighbors through the windows, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly, scanning the scene like a predator calculating the precise moment to strike, not with violence, not with malice, but with the subtle, inescapable force of preparation and knowledge. And as the morning sun crept higher, reflecting off the polished hardwood floors and illuminating the stacks of meticulously organized documents on every surface, it became painfully clear that the HOA president had walked straight into a situation she neither understood nor controlled, because the documents themselves told a story of meticulous planning, legal mastery, historical property knowledge, and foresight so thorough that every argument she might make, every complaint she might try to leverage, had already been anticipated and countered, and while she shifted uncomfortably on the sidewalk trying to mask her fear, Grandpa's voice rang out from inside, calm but commanding, so precise it carried across the yard and into the ears of everyone present. "You have trespassed, harassed, and misrepresented this property for long enough. Step back or step out entirely and consider this a final warning." And the words hit harder than any courtroom ruling because they were not a threat, they were a declaration of inevitability, a statement that the consequences of her arrogance were no longer abstract possibilities but tangible outcomes she could see, hear, and feel. And the officers, realizing that enforcing an HOA request in this context could escalate beyond their remit, began to murmur among themselves, trying to find a legal foothold or a neutral phrasing that might allow them to retreat without admitting complicity. But Grandpa anticipated every hesitation, every glance, every unspoken doubt, and the way he watched the HOA president struggle to regain her composure, shoulders slumping, eyes wide with disbelief, made it clear to the neighbors and officers alike that she had been thoroughly outmaneuvered, not by luck, not by chance, but by the patient, calculated brilliance of a man who had spent decades mastering the precise rules and loopholes that she had assumed would give her the upper hand. And as the sunlight glinted off the brass fixtures in the doorway, highlighting Grandpa's calm, unshakable posture, a sense of collective awe rippled through the small crowd, because everyone knew in that moment that they were witnessing a rare display of true control, someone who could bend circumstance without raising his voice, someone whose preparation rendered even authority figures uncertain. And as the neighbors recorded the scene on their phones, capturing every subtle gesture, every controlled breath, and every moment of growing panic on the HOA president's face, it became obvious that this was no longer a dispute about lawns or fences or petty rules, but a demonstration of power, patience, and inevitability, and while the HOA president attempted to speak, to assert herself, to salvage even a fragment of authority, Grandpa's gaze, sharp and unyielding, cut across the porch, the lawn, and the street, and with a single deliberate gesture, motioned toward the officers, who immediately understood that the man before them was not to be bargained with, not to be pressured, and certainly not to be underestimated. And as the morning stretched on, the unfolding scene became almost surreal, neighbors whispering, cameras capturing the tableau, the HOA president frozen in disbelief, and Grandpa remaining seated, calm, in control, a masterclass in quiet dominance, patience, and the execution of a plan that had clearly been in motion for far longer than anyone around him could imagine. And the weight of his presence, the undeniable authority he radiated, made it clear that the small, bureaucratic empire the HOA president had built in her own mind had been dismantled with a precision that left no room for recovery, no room for argument, only the realization that she had been outplayed at every level, and that her arrogance, her assumptions, and her impulsive attempt to leverage the police against a man who had anticipated it all, had placed her and the officers on a stage where every move, every word, every hesitation was recorded and evaluated, leaving them helpless to undo what had already been orchestrated, leaving the HOA president to understand, finally, the full measure of her mistake, and the neighbors to grasp that real authority, true control, and lasting influence do not come from titles, complaints, or self-importance. They come from preparation, knowledge, patience, and the ability to act decisively when everyone else is still fumbling in arrogance. And as Grandpa leaned back, eyes scanning the assembled crowd with a calm certainty, the scene was set for consequences that would ripple far beyond the morning, far beyond the street, far beyond the petty ambitions of a single HOA president, because when a man of his caliber chooses to act, the results are inexorable, unavoidable, and undeniable, and in that moment, every person present, from the officers to the neighbors, to the now quivering HOA president, understood that they had all underestimated him, that the facade of frailty had been shattered, and that from this point forward, the story of the evening would be one of awe, caution, and lessons learned too late. The street had gone silent again, but this silence was different from the tense stillness of previous hours. It was the kind of silence heavy with realization, the moment when every person present, from the officers still lingering on the porch to the neighbors who had quietly edged closer to catch every detail, to the HOA president who now looked as though she might collapse under the weight of her own miscalculation, understood that they were witnessing something far larger than a mere property dispute, far more consequential than petty arguments over lawns, fences, or minor infractions, because Grandpa, seated in his recliner as sunlight poured through the tall, clean windows, radiated a calm authority that seemed to bend the atmosphere around him, a presence so meticulously controlled that every movement, every gesture, every glance communicated that he had long since anticipated this moment, and that every contingency, every overreach, every attempt to intimidate him had already been accounted for in ways invisible to anyone who did not know the history of the man, the depth of his knowledge, and the patience he had cultivated over decades of quietly observing the world, mastering laws, loopholes, and human behavior alike. And as the HOA president tried to speak, opening her mouth to assert authority, to demand compliance, or to fabricate some semblance of control, her words faltered, choked off by the reality of the scene, by the overwhelming clarity that she had misjudged him, underestimated his intelligence, and failed to foresee the consequences of her own arrogance, while the officers shifted uneasily, hands hovering near their belts, exchanging uneasy glances, because even they could feel the subtle but unmistakable authority emanating from Grandpa, the kind of presence that doesn't shout or wave weapons, that doesn't bluster or threaten, but simply exists with absolute certainty and calm, a presence that forces recognition, compliance, and respect, simply because it is undeniable. And the neighbors, quietly recording, whispering, some nodding in awe, some murmuring to each other in disbelief, understood that the petty spectacles of HOA power, the letters, the citations, the meetings, the calls to police, all paled in comparison to the careful, deliberate mastery of someone who had spent a lifetime quietly preparing for exactly this kind of situation. And Grandpa, noticing every movement, every facial expression, every micro-gesture of panic, amusement, or fear, slowly rose from his chair, moving with measured precision toward the front door, each step deliberate, each movement signaling that he was entirely in control of the physical space, the psychological landscape, and the consequences that were about to unfold. And as he opened the door once more, this time stepping onto the porch, the HOA president's breath caught in her throat, her face pale, her body rigid, because the man she had assumed to be frail, confused, and powerless now stood fully erect, eyes sharp, gaze fixed on her in a way that made her skin crawl, the lines of his face etched not with anger, but with the sheer weight of someone who had long ago learned how to dismantle arrogance and entitlement without ever raising his voice, and Grandpa's voice, calm, deliberate, commanding, carried across the yard and into the ears of everyone present. You have made assumptions. You have acted prematurely. You have underestimated not only this property but the consequences of your own actions, and the words hung in the air, palpable and undeniable, sending a ripple of fear through the HOA president, making her shrink back, clutching the clipboard as if it could protect her, while the officers stiffened, realizing that even their authority carried little weight here, that this was a man who understood law, precedent, and human nature at a level that rendered the ordinary instruments of control nearly irrelevant. And as Grandpa gestured toward the street, toward the gathered neighbors who had become unwitting witnesses, he continued, slowly, deliberately, with a precision that made every word land like a hammer, "Consider this your final notice. Any further attempts to intimidate, harass, or misrepresent this property will be met with responses so comprehensive that the consequences will extend far beyond the immediate parties involved." And the implications of that statement, combined with the calm certainty in his posture, the meticulous preparation evident in every document, photograph, and legal record on display inside the home, caused a shiver to run down the spines of those watching, because it was clear that this was not an idle threat, that the man standing before them had already calculated every possible move they might make, and that he was fully capable of acting decisively, effectively, and ruthlessly should they continue to challenge him. And as the sunlight caught the edges of his sleeves, highlighting the deliberate fold of his hands, the quiet, commanding set of his shoulders, and the sharp clarity in his eyes, the HOA president realized too late that the battle she had assumed she would win in minutes, that she had assumed she controlled with authority and bureaucracy, had been lost from the moment she chose to overreach, and that Grandpa, seated, standing, moving, speaking, and watching, had orchestrated the entire evening with a calm precision that left no room for argument, no room for retreat, and no room for her fragile ego to survive unscathed. And as neighbors exchanged glances, whispering, recording, absorbing every moment, and the officers shifted, uneasy, uncertain how to proceed without escalating beyond the bounds of legal caution, the full measure of what had just unfolded became clear to everyone present. This was not simply an HOA dispute. This was a demonstration of power, patience, preparation, and knowledge so complete that it rendered conventional authority impotent. And as Grandpa, calm and unyielding, stepped back onto the porch, the finality of his presence cemented in the minds of everyone watching, the HOA president could do nothing but stare, realizing that her arrogance, her assumptions, and her misjudgment had led her here, to a confrontation she could not control, with a man whose calm mastery made every letter, citation, call, and meeting she had orchestrated seem petty, inconsequential, and irrelevant. And in that moment the neighborhood held its breath, the officers hesitated, and Grandpa, seated once more, folding his hands calmly, allowed the silence to settle around the block like a tangible weight, a reminder that preparation, knowledge, and the ability to act decisively at the precise moment when others flounder is far more powerful than arrogance, bureaucracy, or brute authority. And that evening, every person on the street understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary, a quiet, unassailable victory of intellect, patience, and the indomitable will of a man who refused to be underestimated, who refused to be bullied, and who had spent a lifetime ensuring that when the moment came, he would stand unshaken, undeniable, and utterly in control, leaving the HOA president trembling, the officers hesitant, and the neighbors silently acknowledging that true power often wears the guise of quiet confidence, meticulous preparation, and absolute calm, and that anyone foolish enough to challenge it without understanding its depth would pay a price that extended far beyond their imagination. The morning had fully broken over the street now, sunlight spilling across the perfectly manicured lawns, yet the atmosphere was thick with the residue of the previous night's confrontation, a tension that clung to the air like fog and refused to dissipate because everyone present, neighbors, officers, and most of all the HOA president, knew that what had transpired was not just a simple dispute over property lines or petty enforcement of neighborhood rules, but an event that had revealed the full measure of a man's preparation, intelligence, and calm authority. And as Grandpa stepped once more onto his porch, the air practically vibrating with the unspoken weight of his presence, he surveyed the gathered crowd with eyes that missed nothing, that catalogued every gesture, every twitch, every micro-expression, and even though his stance was relaxed, the quiet command radiating from him communicated a power far beyond physical strength, far beyond bureaucratic title, and far beyond the reach of any HOA rule, because power, real power, is not granted by committees or regulations. It is claimed, cultivated, and exercised with precision, and Grandpa had spent decades refining it, preparing for precisely this moment when arrogance, overconfidence, and the foolish belief that small rules could intimidate a lifetime of experience would meet him face to face. And as he spoke, his voice carrying across the street in perfect calm, it cut through the air with surgical precision. You have witnessed the results of assumption, of underestimation, and of pride unchecked by foresight. Let this be the final record of what happens when authority is misapplied and hubris blinds judgment. And as the words settled, the HOA president, her face ashen and pale with disbelief, realized that the carefully constructed narrative she had intended, of a victorious inspection, of a triumphant assertion of dominance over an elderly homeowner, had been utterly dismantled, shredded by the sheer weight of Grandpa's preparation and unshakable calm. And as he turned his gaze slowly toward the police officers, who now shifted uneasily, uncertain whether to act or retreat, he continued, not with anger, but with the inevitability of one who has foreseen every outcome. Officers, you have seen what I have prepared, what I have maintained, and what I can enforce. Understand that intervention without understanding only compounds consequences, and that any further misjudgments will be met with actions already anticipated, and the officers, trained to measure authority and assess risk, could only nod subtly, understanding that this was no longer a simple matter of law enforcement. They were witnesses to a complete recalibration of perceived power, a demonstration of control so meticulous and deliberate that the imbalance of authority they had assumed had been obliterated, and the neighbors, still whispering among themselves, recording with their phones, capturing every subtle movement, every deliberate gesture, every inflection in Grandpa's calm, commanding voice, realized that they were seeing more than a home defense or HOA humiliation. They were seeing a strategic dismantling of arrogance itself, a living example of patience, preparation, and experience leveraged to produce undeniable outcomes. And the HOA president, now trembling, tried to speak, tried to salvage some shred of dignity or authority, but her words faltered, caught in her throat, swallowed by the realization that her overconfidence had led her into a trap she could not escape, and that every step she had taken to assert control had only exposed her to humiliation, scrutiny, and the quiet but absolute dominance of a man who had anticipated every move before she had even conceived it. And Grandpa, sensing the collapse of her composure, allowed a faint, controlled smile to form, not cruel, not mocking, but precise, the kind of smile that communicates understanding, inevitability, and the quiet triumph of preparation. And then, with deliberate slowness, he gestured toward the house, signaling the officers and the HOA president to observe the interior, where every document, every photograph, every meticulously recorded proof of compliance, ownership, and preparation was displayed like a masterclass in anticipation, leaving no argument uncountered, no claim unchallenged, and no room for escape from accountability. And as the HOA president's hands shook, her clipboard slipping to the ground once more, Grandpa spoke again, voice steady, measured, and final. Let this be remembered. Authority misapplied is not merely ineffective. It is visible, it is recorded, and it carries consequences beyond immediate comprehension. And for those who believed they could manipulate, intimidate, or control me without understanding the depth of preparation, this day is a record of the inevitable result. And the words echoed across the street, amplified by the quiet awe of the neighbors, the officers, and the children who had cautiously emerged from behind blinds, capturing every nuance, because the demonstration of power, patience, and intelligence was undeniable, palpable, and unforgettable. And as Grandpa slowly retreated into his house, closing the door with deliberate care, leaving the HOA president frozen, shaking, and utterly defeated, and the police officers awkwardly standing by, unsure how to proceed without interfering in a situation that had transcended their original call, the neighborhood absorbed the full impact of the day's events, the totality of the lesson, and the undeniable reality that the man they had once assumed to be fragile, quiet, and inconsequential was, in fact, a force of intellect, experience, and measured authority that rendered the petty ambitions of an HOA president insignificant, irrelevant, and foolish. And in the silence that followed, heavy with awe, whispers, and the occasional click of a phone capturing history, the HOA president finally sank to the sidewalk, defeated, humiliated, and fully aware that her arrogance had been met not with confrontation, not with shouting, not with procedural enforcement, but with the subtle, comprehensive, and inescapable consequences of underestimating a man who had prepared for every eventuality. And as the neighbors slowly dispersed, recording and sharing the moment for all who might need the lesson, as the officers finally nodded, acknowledging the situation without comment, and as the street returned to its quiet normalcy, It was clear to everyone that Grandpa had not merely defended his home. He had demonstrated a masterclass in control, patience, preparation, and the unavoidable consequences of hubris. Leaving the HOA president humbled, the officers cautious, the neighbors in awe, and the story of that morning destined to become legend, remembered not for petty HOA power struggles, not for fines or citations, but for the quiet, undeniable dominance of a man who had anticipated every misstep, every assumption, and every arrogance, and executed a lesson in authority so complete, so measured, and so unforgettable that it would echo across the neighborhood, across conversations, and across time. A testament to the truth that true power is rarely loud, rarely aggressive, and rarely obvious, but when exercised with knowledge, patience, and absolute calm, it leaves nothing but clarity, recognition, and awe in its wake. The tension on the block had shifted from nervous curiosity to outright fear, though fear of a type that few could articulate, because everyone now understood, on some fundamental level, that the events unfolding were not merely a dispute between a homeowner and an overzealous HOA president, but a carefully orchestrated demonstration of control, precision, and the consequences of arrogance. And the HOA president, once brimming with confidence, now looked every inch the caricature of someone who had misjudged reality, clutching her clipboard as if it were a life raft in a storm, as she watched Grandpa step onto his porch once more, this time carrying nothing but his calm, deliberate presence. And with each step he took, the air seemed to thicken, as though the quiet authority he radiated was a tangible force that pressed in on everyone nearby, forcing attention, respect, and for those foolish enough to challenge it, fear. And as neighbors whispered amongst themselves, phones still recording, children peeking from behind curtains, and even the officers holding their ground with a mixture of duty and disbelief, Grandpa lifted his gaze toward the street, toward the gathering crowd, and spoke with the measured cadence of a man who had spent a lifetime understanding people, situations, and the subtle leverage of knowledge. I hope everyone present understands the gravity of what has just transpired. This is not a game. This is the result of years of preparation, observation, and understanding of both law and human nature. And for those who believe they could manipulate, intimidate, or overreach, consider this your final lesson. And with that he paused, letting the words sink into the air, into the minds of everyone who had gathered. And even though he did not raise his voice, the command within it was undeniable, a presence so fully calibrated that even the police officers, trained to read authority and assess risk, could feel the unspoken weight, the calculated danger of challenging him. And the HOA president, eyes wide, realized with growing horror that she had unleashed something far beyond her understanding, because Grandpa's mastery extended beyond the physical space of his porch or the documents neatly stacked inside. It extended into the psychological, into the unseen networks of knowledge, observation, and preparedness that allowed him to anticipate every misstep, every lie, every overreach, and counter it before it had even fully formed. And as he gestured slowly toward the edge of the lawn, where cameras discreetly but strategically captured every angle, he continued, "This is not merely about property, not merely about compliance, not merely about a misunderstanding. It is about respect, foresight, and accountability, and for those who fail to comprehend these principles, the consequences will be visible, undeniable, and inescapable." And the implications of those words struck the HOA president like a physical blow, as she realized that every threat she had made, every call to authority, every attempt to impose her will, had not only failed but had exposed her to scrutiny, ridicule, and the silent judgment of an entire neighborhood, all of whom now recognized that the man they had assumed to be fragile, quiet, and inconsequential was, in fact, a force of deliberate and formidable intellect, experience, and control. And as Grandpa's eyes swept over the assembled witnesses, lingering on officers who shifted uneasily in the morning light, on neighbors clutching their phones, recording every moment, and finally returning to the HOA president, the unspoken message was clear: the days of overreach, arrogance, and baseless authority were over, and the reality of their miscalculation would haunt them long after this morning had passed. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he stepped back slightly, folded his hands calmly, and allowed the silence to stretch, knowing that in moments of unspoken tension, the realization of one's own folly lands far more effectively than anger or argument ever could. And the HOA president, frozen in place, suddenly felt the full measure of humiliation, the kind that comes not from confrontation but from witnessing the quiet dismantling of one's assumptions, plans, and self-perceived authority by a man who had anticipated every step, every overconfidence, every foolish attempt to assert control. And in that silence, as the neighborhood collectively held its breath, children peeking from blinds, neighbors whispering, Officers unsure how to proceed without interfering in what had become clearly a demonstration of personal authority and legal mastery, the weight of the lesson became palpable. And Grandpa, calm, deliberate, and entirely in command, delivered it without raising his voice, without a single act of aggression, but with the force of inevitability that only patience, knowledge, and preparation can generate. And as he finally retreated inside, leaving the porch and lawn in quiet, calculated perfection, the HOA president sank to the edge of the walkway, her clipboard clattering to the ground, and for the first time she understood what it truly meant to underestimate someone, to misjudge, to overreach without understanding. And the neighborhood, officers and witnesses, now fully aware of the power shift, collectively realized that they had witnessed a masterclass in control, strategy, and the consequences of arrogance, and that this day, this confrontation, would become legend on the block, not for petty HOA drama, not for citations or fines, but for the quiet, inexorable dismantling of hubris by a man who had spent a lifetime mastering the art of preparation, observation, and execution, leaving every person present humbled, awed, and acutely aware that appearances are deceiving, assumptions are dangerous, and that patience, knowledge, and calm authority are far more formidable than shouting, bureaucracy, or threats ever could be. And the echoes of that morning, of that carefully orchestrated display of dominance, would linger long after the street returned to its suburban normalcy, a testament to what happens when arrogance meets a man who has anticipated every move. And the HOA president, police, and neighbors alike would never forget the lesson, nor the quiet power with which it had been delivered.